Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Precision Ag Insight webcast on using on-farm trials to optimize your inputs. On the phone with me today is Dr. Chad Godsey. Chad is the owner and founder of Godsey Precision Ag. He has a master's and PhD in agronomy and soil fertility. Before founding Godsey Precision Ag, he worked as a cropping system specialist at Oklahoma State University doing research and extension there, especially focusing on increasing efficiency of crop production. So when we decided to do today's Precision Ag Insight webcast on the topic of using trials to increase your productivity, we gave Chad a call and asked him if he would provide some insights from both his work with Godsey Precision Ag and also his previous experience working with Oklahoma State. So Chad, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights with us.
Sure thing, Angela.
We all know that on-farm research is important to answer questions that growers have about new products, new precision ag practices. If done well, it can increase grower profitability and help folks stay ahead of compliance. It supports stewardship and sustainability. But it can be challenging. We know because we asked when you guys registered, we asked you, how often do you meet your objectives for on-farm trials? And half of you said either you don't meet your objectives or you meet your objectives less than 50% of the time. And so that's why we're really here today to talk about some things that you can do to help you meet your objectives for on-farm trials. So Chad, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned a few things that you do to help make sure that your efforts are successful. So I thought we'd start off by talking about those. Your first tip for folks is to start by focusing on quality over quantity. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean when you say quality over quantity?
Yeah, for sure. Well, basically, you know, there's two, I think of two different approaches when initiating on-farm research trials. Basically, one is to set out just a few, you know, let's say 4 or 5 quality trials, and then just focus on those. Be out there when they're put out or planted, and be out there when they're harvested. And the other approach is to kind of a shotgun blast approach, I guess you could say, and put out numerous trials, you know, 20 to 30 or 40 trials, and then just hope on getting you know, about 50% of those back. And the problem that I have with the larger approach, and sometimes that's what we have to take because we just can't physically, don't have the personnel or the labor, the hours to invest in that research. I always question that data when it comes back, if the treatments were applied correctly, if the, you know, yield data is correct, things like that. So I always encourage the quality over the quantity. Just focus on a few trials that you can manage. Try to be out there physically when you plant them, and then when you harvest them, and make multiple observations during the growing season. I think that's always a better approach than just throwing out numerous trials and hoping to get a few back.
And Chad, along those lines, I know when we spoke before, you mentioned that you know, it takes a lot of effort at first, but once you're working with somebody and they start to see the results of those trials and understand what it takes to put them out and get good quality results that they can use to make decisions going forward, that provides them, you know, a little bit of encouragement and a little bit of experience that they're actually able to operate more independently going forward. Would you say that that's been your experience?
Yeah. That's definitely a true statement. You know, in years 1 and 2, you know, most clients or producers do need a little more help in putting out the trials and collecting the data throughout the season and at harvest. But you know, in years 3, 4, or 5 down the road, they know what their expectations are. And they realize the value. So definitely, the time in the, you know, the first time around, or the first 2 times around in putting out trials, it's definitely a good investment for the future years.
All right, thanks. So your next tip that you had for folks when we spoke earlier was to keep it simple. So would you mind talking a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, a lot of cases we try to answer all the questions in a given year or a single year, and so we may have 2 or 3 trials in the same field, and some of those may overlap. And sometimes we do want to see what the interaction is between, let's say, 2 fertilizer products or fertilizer and fungicide. But this often complicates things, and when we step back at the end of the year, we really don't have a good picture of what caused the response, the yield response in that given year. So my philosophy is always keep it small and simple, simple A versus B type setup, a simple yes/no question. Is the best way to start out, especially when you're beginning with a new client or new farmer. Keep it simple, and then there's always improvement going from year 1 to year 2. There's always things you can do better trial placement and things like that. So just keep it simple.
Okay, so rather than trying to answer too much in one year, get a good answer for 1 or maybe 2 questions, and then focus on building on that the next year.
Yep, you're exactly right.
Okay. So the last key to success that we talked about earlier was the idea of reducing noise. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today are different techniques for reducing noise. And to get us started with that, would you mind talking a little bit about what types of noise that you often see in trials? And then we'll get into those techniques on helping to reduce that.
Okay. The 3 common potential areas of what we call noise or refer to as noise here. The first one being spatial variability. This is something that we've struggled with on-farm research trials for forever, since we started doing since yield monitors were invented and started being utilized. That's why we've always steered away from large-scale or field-scale research, is because of that spatial variability. And that's something that we'll continue to address here throughout the presentation. But that's one thing that when we get into the Ag Veritas demo, you can see how that handles the spatial variability. But that's something that we need to keep take into account when we're placing trials, whether it be soils, elevation, or whatever it may be. The second thing is temporal variability. We really don't have any control over this, and this is just considering the year-to-year weather. The human error is the third thing, and this, of course, we have control over the human error, and this is something that we just need to take into account and keep in the back of our mind when we're applying treatments, planning, and that kind of stuff. So those are the typically 3 areas or sources of noise that we see.
And to help demonstrate a little bit about the spatial variability, we have an example here that you shared with us. Would you mind talking us through this example and how it demonstrates the challenges of dealing with some of that spatial variability?
Yes, this was an example from 2 growing seasons ago. I guess what I would say, a typical fungicide trial. We had the west half of this field that applied fungicide, and the east half did not receive fungicide. When we step back and analyze the results at the end of the year, we saw on average a 7 bushel increase. However, once we did a little more digging and looking at historic yield potential, we saw that the west half was always 5 to 7 bushels per acre better. So this is a classic example of soils. We didn't take into account the soils on either half. We basically split the fungicide application right along a soils change in this field. So this is just an example of where we didn't do the proper background work or initial work to make sure we place those trials in a good part of the field.
All right, thanks for sharing that example with us. We're going to learn a little bit more about how to make sure your trial layout considers some of that spatial variability in just a minute. So one thing that we spoke about earlier, one thing you said when we spoke earlier really stood out to me. You said you can never be 100% certain that yield differences in a trial are due solely to the treatments being evaluated. And I thought that really speaks to the heart of why we're here today, is to learn how to better manage the planning and the analysis so that hopefully we can make best decisions possible given all of that noise that can be often introduced. So before we get into some specific techniques, I thought we'd visit the other registration question that everyone answered. What is the biggest challenge you face in achieving your objectives for on-farm trials? A lot of you, 40% of you about, said that collecting data is actually your biggest challenge. But a lot of you also have challenges just getting a clear answer once you have the data, or even getting the trial put out correctly. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about, first of all, setting clear objectives, and then other things that you can do to help address some of those issues. So we're going to start by talking about a trial plan. And when we spoke earlier, Chad, there was really three critical pieces that stood out. The first is making a good question. So can you talk with us a little bit about how you define your questions when you're setting up a trial and what makes a good question?
Okay, and this, this really isn't. This should be the easiest part of setting up an on-farm research trial. Is defining that question, and it's the easiest step in the process, but it's probably the most important. And if you recall the poll question from earlier in the webinar, a lot of us fail to do this, or maybe fail to do it, to specifically state the question that we're trying to address with the research. Once again, like I mentioned earlier, keep it simple. So if we're evaluating two products, it simply is product A better than product B. Simple question, two products that we're comparing, so pretty straightforward. Another example would be if we're trying to evaluate, say, current management zones. Let's say it's seeding management zones. So we could simply ask, if I increase or decrease application rate of this product by 10% in each management zone, how much will my yield increase or decrease? So clearly state that question and keep it simple. And then also, when we are defining that question, something to keep in the back of our minds is consider other factors that may influence the trial outcome. A typical one we see here that sometimes we don't think about until after the fact is hybrid or varietal differences. We kind of just plant whatever corn hybrid we were going to there, without taking into consideration what trial we're doing in that field, and things like that. And also management practices. Is it no-till, strip till, conventional till, and will that potentially have an influence on that trial outcome? So those are things that you need to keep in the back of your mind before you do state those questions. Angela.
Okay, great. So kind of keeping those things in mind will help to frame some of the next steps, which we're going to talk about next. So the next thing is the layout, and those background factors or other things that might impact a trial. I know that's some of the things that you consider when you start to think about your layout, but there are actually lots of things that you can have to take into account, or that some people take into account when they're considering their layout. So we thought we'd start by asking our audience today to participate in a brief poll with us about what are the factors that you often consider when you are planning a trial. So you could see the question here on your screen, and give me one moment and you'll be able to respond and share your thoughts about what are the things that you consider when you're deciding on trial placement. Looks like most folks have had a chance to vote, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So it looks like a lot of you are considering field conditions, your plan for data collection. Chad, is this in line with what you were expecting or what you hear when you speak with folks?
Yeah, it really is, and it's I guess it's nice to see that field conditions that might affect response are as high as they are. Typically we kind of do whatever's easiest, which is sometimes what we have to do. But yeah, it's good to see that field conditions are taken into account that at that higher rate.
All right, let's get started on the next section here then and actually talk about, Chad, what some of your recommendations are for trial placement. And it looks like some of our audience is already doing some of those things at least. So there's 4 considerations for trial placement that you mentioned when we talked about earlier. And the first one is the objective and how that plays in to how you lay out your trial. Would you speak a little bit about your philosophy on that?
Yeah, so once we have that question or objective outlined, we can really start to think about trial placement in that field. And there's 2 basic ways that we typically set up on-farm research trials. The first one that we'll briefly discuss are check strips. This is ideal for when we have new products or practices that we want to evaluate. We really do not have any indication of how or where they may respond in a field. So this is kind of a blind, I guess you could say, approach. We want to make sure we have observations in all areas of the field, all yield potential zones or whatever zones you may have delineated, different elevations, different soils types. So it really allows us to see how response varies across the field. The other approach that we sometimes use are test plots or check plots. You hear them referred to as either. With test plots, we really use these to refine an existing practice. So going back to that example of a seeding rate zone, we may place a test plot in one zone or each zone in the field. Plus 10 or minus 10% lower or higher seeding rate. And one advantage of this is with the smaller test plots is that we can test a change on a small area to minimize yield impact. We don't want to plant 20 acres at 26,000 say population in corn and see a negative impact on yield. No farmer or client would like to see that. So in the test plots are something that we easily can do with prescriptions as well. Those are kind of the 2 basic approaches that you can take, and it really depends on what your objectives are, equipment and things like that.
All right, thank you. The next piece of information that we talked about is the idea of including background information, which we know a lot of our audience is already doing, which is great. We spoke earlier, I know that there are some things that you try to avoid when you're considering background information, and then other cases where you actually try to get information from different types of areas of the field. So would you mind sharing with our audience a little bit about your approach on that?
Yeah, so typically when we look at a field, and if we have past yield data, multi-year yield analysis, we'll look at things like that. Some of the things that we try to avoid are unstable areas. So one year those areas may be high yielding, the next year it may be low yielding, and so forth. So we try to avoid those areas. The only exception to that rule is if we have a product that we think may stabilize that area or improve yield in that area, then obviously we would want to identify those areas. Field edges. Sometimes we see field edges be included in trial analysis often, and we've always want to stay away from field edges. Ideally, depending on equipment width and stuff, but probably 60 feet at a minimum as far as staying away from the field edges. The second thing to take into account are soils, topography or elevation, and then yield potential, like I mentioned previously with that historic yield data. If you have that information at hand before laying out a trial, you'll greatly increase your chances of getting good results when you take those 3 things into account.
Okay. And I know that that historic yield data is a really important piece for you, both to identify unstable areas, but also to identify different management zones so that you can see how different practices might vary in those zones. Would you mind sharing a little bit about why that you think that's important and how you go about creating those zones and considering them in your trials?
Yeah, of course. I think historic yield data, not only for delineating the management zones, but for evaluating on-farm trials or placement of on-farm trials is very valuable. For one thing, it kind of takes into account the temporal variability, and this is something that we struggle to address with using any kind of statistics or anything. So it kind of takes into account that temporal variability. It identifies those stable areas in the field. Is it always, so you can answer that question, is this area always high yielding or is it always low yielding? And the second thing is it provides a baseline to compare some treatments against. So we can see what that treatment does compared to historic trends. Does it increase, does it increase yield compared to long-term averages and things like that? And it's also, the third point I wanted to make was it's useful for problematic areas. And for those of you familiar with high pH soils and iron deficiency, this is, it may identify problem areas, so we can put those treatments through those areas and make sure that they pass. Those treatment strips pass through the middle of that problematic area. And the last point that I want to make on this slide, Angela, is just, we can create those yield potential zones with historic yield data. So it really enables us to incorporate that, into the management zones and run those test strips through all zones. And it gives us a good way to view the data from as well, when we can break down the yield response by management zone, because with almost any product we evaluate, it's not going to have a uniform response across the field. It may respond more in the high yielding zones as opposed to the low yielding zones. So it really gives us a good comparison of, within each management zone, how is that response from that product viewed. And then too, it may, who knows, in the future, it may let us create a variable rate prescription map based on that response.
Okay, thanks for sharing that information with us. And I have a map here that you shared with us of some zones that you've created for a field, and just so people can have an idea of what that looks like. Would you briefly sort of explain what we're looking at here?
So yeah, on this or on the screen is a relative grain yield with 4 years of yield data included. That's on the left-hand side of the screen. So basically delineating those high yielding zones, average yielding zones, and low yielding zones. So the green areas would be above average yield. The yellow area would be what we consider average yielding, and the orange and red area would be historically low yielding average. And the second image to the right of the screen is the year-to-year stability. So that's where we're looking at identifying or making sure those zones or areas are stable. So the darker purple areas would be a case where we may want to avoid putting our strips in those locations, just because something is influencing the year-to-year variability there. It could be soils, it could be drainage. We're just not sure what it is, so we may want to stay away from those areas.
All right, thank you.
So that's a classic example of how we use that.
Okay, great, thanks. So we'll move on to the next point here then, our next consideration for trial layout, which is equipment and logistics, which really relates back to that big group we saw that say that data collection is their biggest challenge. So would you mind telling us a little bit about how you incorporate that into your trial planning?
Yeah, definitely, and this is kind of a common sense. We want to make this as easy as possible for the producer to get those treatments out. So, things we got to consider is width of applicator, whether it's planter, fertilizer spreader, or sprayer, and then also ultimately the width of the combine, because that's what influences the quality, or has a huge influence on the quality of yield data collected at the end of the season. So obviously we want to try to match the either planter width or applicator width with the combine width, because this just reduces the amount of time that we have got to spend cleaning the data at the end of the year, that's a classic area where we see human error introduced into it, is when we have to clean that data. Maybe we forget to, or we clean the wrong pass. So things like that, matching it. And this is just the two maps or images on the bottom are places where two different kind of scenarios where we could not match the planter width with the combine width. So in the case on the image in the lower left, we knew that our planter was not going to match our combine width. So we placed our seeding check plots perpendicular to the direction of the planter, just because we thought this would improve our accuracy of making sure that we at least had 2 or 3 clean passes with the planter through the middles of those strips, since we could not match the width of the planter with the combine. The example on the right is just a simple strip. We replicated it twice in this south side of the field, a compost trial, and of course with compost spreader, manure spreader, the spread pattern is highly variable. So we just wanted to make sure we were wide enough that we had some clean strips through the middle of this. So kind of two unique situations, but so we really want to try to match the width of the combine when possible with our application strips.
All right, thank you. So some things to consider when you're laying out your trial there, thinking all the way to the end of the year and harvesting, and sort of what that data is going to look like in the end. That's really helpful. Thank you. So we'll move on to the fourth point that you made when we were speaking earlier, which is about the 3 R's. And this is really around planning your trial in a way that, statistically speaking, is well done, so that you have a higher chance of getting a clear answer at the end. Would you mind talking us through what the 3 R's are and how you think about them and consider them when you're laying out your trials?
Okay. The 3 R's we refer to here are replicate, randomize, and request help. And some of these are more important than others, and it kind of depends on what our question is that we've clearly defined. Replication, why we encourage replication is it enables a separation of the treatment effects from some of that background noise we talked about earlier. And some things to keep in mind is that when possible, design replications to be within relative uniform areas of the field. So you don't want to have replications that are located on the side of a hill. So some of the treatments may be at the top of the hill, some of them may be at the bottom, and some of them on the side slope. So using common sense on placing those replications. But replications are very important. Too many times we see half versus a half of the field. If you recall the fungicide example we had previously, when we separated a field just in half, that really influenced our trial outcome, just because we did not have replication in that case. If we would have had replication on both halves of the field, or both sides of the field, we probably wouldn't have had to worry about that background noise being introduced by the soil types. And one comment here is that some cases, and Angela, I'm sure you've seen this, is that sometimes we maybe over-replicate, and a lot of times this can introduce noise from human or machine error. Sometimes we'll see split planter stuff throughout the entire field, or split sprayer applications. And this just is kind of it's hard to manage the data, I guess you would say, the yield data at the end of the year when you have alternating passes throughout the entire field. And I would in a perfect world that is a good setup. But just managing that data and knowing where those passes, where that product got applied, it just makes it more difficult in keeping the data straight.
Yes, that's a great point. We have seen that with some analyses that we've seen people doing using Veritas. To your point about human error and machine error, and sort of trying to plan so that you get a nice clean pass and you can really clearly understand what happens. That over-replication, we have seen that be a challenge in some cases and introduce a lot of challenges from a data cleaning standpoint at the end of the year. So the next of the 3 R's that you mentioned when we talked about earlier was randomize, and I understand this isn't really always necessary, but there are some times when it can be helpful. So would you mind sharing a little bit about what that means and when people might want to think about this?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the randomization is more important when we're testing several products, or maybe we have multiple seeding rates. We have 4 or 5 seeding rates we're testing. From a truly speaking statistics standpoint, of course, any statistician will tell you randomization is one of the most important things you need to do. But when we're just comparing 1 or 2 products, there's really, randomization is less important, I guess. So the general rule of thumb that I use is to simply, when we have more than 2 products, then consider randomization. And sometimes it's difficult with equipment to randomize if we're changing seeding rates manually or something like that, or fertilizer rates manually. It makes it more difficult. But when we do have multiple products or seeding rates or different rates, it does decrease the odds that the spatial variability will influence treatment effects. So just keep that in the back of your mind when you are evaluating multiple things.
All right, thanks. And then your last suggestion here for folks is to request help.
Yeah, and request help, especially when initiating or starting out on on-farm research trials, especially with new producers or clients or farmers. Take time, ask somebody for help if you're unsure if the treatment strips are placed correctly or the objectives or questions are clearly defined. And it's always good to have a second set of eyes look over a project or trial before you start, because they may see something, maybe some kind of observation that needs gathered at mid-season or during the growing season that you may not think of. So it's always good to have a second set of eyes look at a trial setup.
Great, and I know you spent quite a few years at Oklahoma State doing research and some extension efforts there. Did you get a lot of questions from folks requesting help while you were there?
Yeah, we did. We did get quite a few, and it was always, I guess, it was always exciting when a producer would come to you and ask questions about setting up an experiment or on-farm trial, and those were the cases where you knew you were going to get good quality data back, because if they're interested in that question, they're going to see it through to the end. So yeah, it definitely was exciting when somebody had asked you a question on that.
All right, so there you heard it. If you go and ask for help, it's going to be exciting for the person you're asking for help from. So you should definitely do it.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to move on now. That's the last tip that we have for the layout. So we're going to move on and talk about the data, which is always a pain point for people. So there are 4 parts of data collection when we spoke earlier that people kind of need to keep in mind. The first is that background information and how that plays into looking at the results. Could you speak a little bit about including background information when you're looking at your trial results, Chad?
Yeah, definitely, and this is just like it says, include including that soils information layer, maybe the historic yield potential, maybe EC data if you have it. Think about that as far as treatment, treatment response, based on that information. So take that into account. Explain those differences, and if you have that background information at hand already from previous trial planning, the preseason or pre-planning stuff, that'll be easy to pull back out and say, okay, well, this is soils affected this response here. Maybe the soil test in this area affected the fertilizer response, and so forth. So having that information already collected and maybe processed, I guess you could say, it helps you evaluate that treatment response a lot easier and quicker.
All right. And the next critical piece, obviously, is the trial data itself. I know you spoke a little bit earlier about thinking about data collection when you're doing the trial layout. Can you share maybe a few tips around things that you do to try to make sure that the trial data is collected correctly? You actually know what went out on the field and can accurately look at the results there at the end of the year.
Yeah, so with some of the things that we do to I guess not increase our odds of collecting good quality data is that we always try to use prescriptions when possible to put out a trial, because that way we know if that prescription is loaded on that monitor and the farmer is utilizing it, or the tractor operator is utilizing it, that'll get applied, and most importantly that we'll get an as planted or an as applied map back from that monitor. So that way we can verify that the treatments did get applied where they were supposed to. So that's a perfect world scenario when we can use a prescription to put out a trial. The second thing is if we can't use a prescription, or the second option when we can't use a prescription, is that we'll georeference that trial so we know where it got applied, and of course that entails us or requires us to be in the field when that trial is put out, which I highly recommend, even if it is with a prescription. It's good to be there the day that it's applied, so there's no question on if and when and where it got applied. You have that data. And that goes back to the point that we made earlier about the quality over quantity statement. You don't want too many trials that you can't be there when it's applied, if possible. So those are the two ways that we kind of ensure that we get good quality data, or that we increase our odds of getting good quality data back at the end of the season.
All right, thanks for sharing your tips on that. The next piece here is in-season observations. I know those can be really important. Would you mind sharing a little bit about how you approach those?
Yeah, with in-season observations, we think that's vital for explaining those differences. And I'll just use an example of the fungicide trial. It's important that you know what diseases, if any, were present in that field during the growing season. So depending on the trial, we'll try to visit trial locations a minimum of two times during the growing season, but oftentimes we're there anywhere from 5 to 7 times during the growing season, just to make general observations, because those tell a lot, go into telling a lot of the story about explaining treatment differences at the end of the season. So the in-season observations are very important and need to be recorded.
Okay. And then last, obviously, collecting the good harvest data is really important. I know you have a few, probably just tips, reminders here for folks on the importance of that and how to make sure you get good harvest data.
Yeah. So this goes back to the quality over quantity statement that we made several times through the webinar presentation here. But when we can physically be there to help producers calibrate, especially if they historically have not done much calibration with their yield monitors, or moisture sensors, it's important that you're physically there to help them at the first time or two. And then making sure that the swath width and the load identification is entered correctly in the monitor. That just makes evaluating that data at the end of the year so much easier. So I can't stress enough, and everybody's heard it, that how important it is to calibrate the yield monitors and moisture sensors.
All right. Thank you for that reminder. We've had some really great questions coming in, and I want to thank everybody that's been putting them in. We are running a little bit long today, so we're going to follow up on all the questions that we're getting after today's webinar. So if you do have questions, please continue to put them in the question box, and we'll be following up with you after. We have just a quick example here to sort of demonstrate some of the tips that you've been talking about today, Chad. And then for those who are interested, we're going to do a real quick demo of Ag Veritas at the end to touch a little bit on the analysis piece. But would you mind talking us through this example, what you did, and how you incorporated some of the tips you shared with us today for this trial?
Yeah, of course. So this, just a little bit of background about this this field or trial. This was a irrigated corn field that we received some hail on middle of June. I guess it was just prior to the V5 growth stage, and so we had a lot of questions on the profitability of applying fungicide at that early growth stage. And especially after hail. So we thought this was an opportune time to evaluate this. So we simply stated the question, is it profitable to apply fungicide to corn at V5? And on this field we had some background information. Of course, we had the soils and elevation information. And we did have management zones, and these were based on historic yield potential. So we had our low, below average, average, above average, and high yielding zones of the field. So we had a decent amount of information to go off of to place these strips. So once we had our question clearly defined and our background information set up, we moved on to the actual trial layout. And you'll notice here we had we had one spot or one strip applied in the north half of the field, and then a second strip just on the south side of the field. Our coverage area here was probably about 30, if I recall, 25 to 30% of the field received fungicide. And then, of course, we had the replication. We had one strip on the north and one strip on the south. And we made sure we had plenty of observations in all management zones, which is another thing that we wanted to make sure, because we kind of assumed that the response to fungicide would not be the same in all management zones. So that's kind of the layout and a quick example of actually applying some of the items that we kind of discussed today.
Okay,
so pretty easy and quick layout, really.
Okay. Yep. Do you mind if I ask you what the conclusion was at the end of your trial here?
Yeah, so the conclusion, the overall summary or conclusion from this was that we did not see a fungicide response, and we kind of looked back at our notes or observations through the season, and basically it was because we just did not have any foliar, any disease pressure come up in 2014. So that's another example of using those in-season notes to maybe, in this case, explain a lack of response.
Okay.
So that was kind of the overall trial summary.
All right, great. Thank you for that. That's a great example. So thank you very much, Chad, for sharing all those tips with us today. We're going to go on. For those of you who have a couple more minutes to stick around, we're going to do a really quick demonstration of Ag Veritas. You can see on your screen now there's contact information for Chad. So if you're interested in following up with him about any of your questions, please feel free to reach out to him. You can also reach out to him through the responding to any of the emails that you received earlier. For those of you who are interested in looking at Ag Veritas, The tool is designed to especially help deal with some of the spatial variability that Chad mentioned earlier today. And so it's an analysis tool that we're going to sort of talk about how you can take a trial laid out the way that Chad has talked about today, run it through Ag Veritas, and the types of results that you can get for those of you who are interested in learning more. So first of all, Ag Veritas is a web-based yield analysis tool. We use some spatial statistics techniques to analyze all the factors that are affecting yield on a given field simultaneously. So we know from all the things that Chad was just talking about, there are lots of field conditions or different management practices that might vary across a field, and trying to reach a clear conclusion because of all of that spatial noise at the end of the year when you're doing a trial can be challenging. So Ag Veritas is designed to help you do that and to help you determine not only if, but actually where it makes the most sense to apply whatever management practice it is that you're testing. So we're going to take a real quick look at how you do that. The example we're going to use today is a fungicide trial also. You can see that it has some nice replication in this trial, as Chad had mentioned earlier, is really helpful. And also, when laying out this trial, the individuals considered the different soil types on the field, which you can see quite a bit of variation, as well as variation in elevation on this field. And so we're going to take a look at whether or not these factors had an impact on the trial result. The question that we're examining today is it profitable to apply fungicide on this field? And also, if you were to do a traditional comparison of averages, you would note an 8 bushel an acre higher yield in the treated areas. And as we're going to see when you use Ag Veritas to dig into a little bit more detail on that spatial variability, you get a little bit more of an interesting answer. So we ran the analysis on those 3 pieces of information that you saw a moment ago. You can see the first thing Ag Veritas does is give you a sense of how much variability there was in your yield overall. For this field, there was about 173 bushels an acre was the average yield, but there was a lot of variation, about 118 bushels an acre of what we would call yield variability. In other words, most of the rate of yield throughout the field ranged anywhere from about 100 bushels an acre to over 200 bushels an acre. And so when you have that much yield variability, we have to ask how much of that change that we saw from the fungicide, that 8 bushels an acre, how much of that is really due to the fungicide and how much of it might be due to other factors, and how might that response vary depending on those factors. So you can see here that we're explaining overall about 31% of the yield variability with the analysis that we ran. And a really important thing here is that something we call spatial effects are having a big impact on the yield variability on this field. And I'm going to explain more about what that means in just a moment. But first I want to point out that the fungicide, elevation, and soil types also are shown to have a relationship to that yield variability. So that means all of these things are having an impact on yield, and we want to try to figure out what's the impact of the fungicide. So let's move on and take a look at how we do that. The first thing that we do is we explore the impact of spatial effects. Spatial effects are areas of a field where yield is unusually high or low even after we've taken into account all the other factors that are impacting yield. So what that means on this particular field is if you see this large blue area here, that's an area where yield is unusually high, given all the other factors that are present there. So considering the soil types that are there, considering the elevation that's there, considering any potential impact of that fungicide, yield is still very, very high there. And so these are areas of the field where something is affecting yield and it's not one of those other factors. So including one of them is really, including these areas is really important to understand the impact of a trial. Because as you saw all those strips going through the field, well, one of them might have gone right through this big spatial effect here, and that might cause yield to look as if it's higher than, or the impact of that fungicide might look like it's higher than it actually is if one of those strips went through there. So the way that we do that, the way that we answer that question with Ag Veritas is we look at all the different areas of a field and see how response varies in different areas of the field. And here's an example of that. You could see that we're examining the untreated area versus the treated area and looking at how that changes across different elevations for a particular soil type. And you can see that the treatment is having seems to be having an impact at the lower elevations more so than at the higher elevations. And what you find is that when you dig into the details and you look at changes in elevation and soil types, that you get really a different answer throughout the field. And so we want to make it easy for you to get a clear answer overall on how all these factors are having an impact on your trial. And so what we do is we allow you to do that in the profit map by examining the overall profitability of a decision. So here we're going to look at if the corn price is $4 an acre, we're going to try to make a decision on investing in this fungicide. We're going to estimate a cost of, say, $12 an acre here and see how that compares with not applying the fungicide. We're going to see how that answer varies across the field in different areas. And we're going to look at it in terms of return on investment, where in some areas of the field our return might be very high, say over 200%, whereas in other areas of the field it might be less than what we need to get a return. And you could see in this field how much variation we get. Some areas of the field we actually are getting a very significant return, whereas other areas of the field we're not getting a return. And so that's just an example of how all of those different pieces of information, all of that noise that can be introduced into a trial can cause variation in response, and how a tool like Ag Veritas can help you to dig in and get a clearer answer at the end of the year. So that's just a quick demonstration of how Ag Veritas can help with that. And Chad, I know you've used Ag Veritas quite a bit for quite a few things. Would you mind sharing any quick comments with the audience about how you use it to help to get a clear answer on the trials that you run? And then we're going to close because we're coming right up to the end of our time here at almost 10:30.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Angela. Well, some of the things that I think that you've highlighted, the dealing with the spatial variability, I think that's probably the most one of the most powerful things that Ag Veritas can do for you that we've always struggled with in the past. So I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the spatial effects and dealing with those and removing those, having the potential to remove those from the analysis because they can greatly influence the outcome. And then the second point I think I would make in how I've used it in evaluating, a lot of our trials, is that it lets you get so much more information or data out of it than just a simple average, strip average. Like you indicated, that the overall average was 8 bushels per increase or per acre increase with fungicide. But when you look at the profit map here, there's so much more information, is more responsive on certain soil types and elevations, which is what we would expect, and we would never get that with just a simple side-by-side comparison, one average versus another average. And I guess one more point that I would make is that I've always struggled to quantify not just on-farm trials but variable rate applications of stuff. And I think this is what the profit map is, what farmers want to see in the end is their return on investment, in a dollars per acre format. So I guess those three things: the spatial variability, the digging deeper part, and then the return an actual profit map are the three things that I think are probably the greatest assets of Ag Veritas.
All right. Thank you very much, Chad, for sharing your experience on that. And thank you so much for everybody for sticking around today. We hope that you found the information shared today to be really helpful. And thank you again so much, Chad, for sharing your insights and spending some time with us today as well.
Thank you, Angela. It's my pleasure.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.